I'm Allison Cruz here in Amelia County in Jetersville, and I'm for the soil.
It is spring, and there is a lot of activity in our region concerning soil health. Hey everybody, I'm Jeff Ishee, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to For the Soil, a Conversation. I'm your host and my co-host, Dr. Eric Bendfeldt with Virginia Cooperative Extension Community Viability, as well as Mary Sketch Bryant with the Virginia Soil Health Coalition are joining me. Dr. Bendfeldt, would you reintroduce our returning guest?
Yes, Jeff. Again, we're very pleased to have Dr. Elizabeth Heilman with us. Dr. Heilman's a professor of education at Wichita State University. And our last episode, we talked a little bit about the emotional ecology of farming and conservation. And I think in this episode, we'd sort of like to transition and talk about the environmental ecology and specifically how farmers can affect rain and help and improve the environment. So welcome, Dr. Heilman.
Thank you.
Dr. Heilman, it is a pleasure to have you as a returning guest for the Soil. And we had a conversation in between these two podcasts that we recorded. You said something that really got my attention. And you insinuated, well, I believe you have the facts to verify this, but you said that farmers collectively can change the weather. Not one individual farm, but large groups of farms in an area or in a region. Those farmers can change the weather. Can you explain?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, they can. 40% of weather is local. Now, that seems crazy that you couldn't possibly have that much variety have to do with local land use and landforms, but it's true. And to give you an understanding of it, all the deserts on the earth that have no life are man-made, right? So the Gobi Desert, the Sahara Desert, where it's just sand, those are man-made. The Sahara Desert has all this evidence underneath that it used to be a rainforest. So how we use land can create desert, or it can take dry conditions and make them healthier. There's nothing about the location on the planet that means the Sahara Desert has to be a desert. Going backwards, right now, the Amazon rainforest is starting to have drought on the edges because they're cutting down the trees. So let's talk about how rain happens. What makes rain? So rain needs a condensation nuclei. Water itself has to form around something. And there's two big types. One comes from dust and pollution, and it's small little particles. Those are not good for steady rain, because dust particles are very little and they will form a drop and then evaporate, form and evaporate. So little children get colder than adults because they have more surface area, right? And the same is true for these little aerosols. So dust droplets have more surface area. So they'll evaporate and they don't form a good raindrop. So here's to the good part of it. What does form a good raindrop? Nature makes its own aerosols. They're called biogenic aerosols. So if you have a lot of plant life in an area, you're going to get more rain. And we kind of know this intuitively, don't we? Places with a lot of plant life are cooler, right? They smell differently. They feel more moist. They are more moist. So the things that make steady rainfall are pollen. Those are a good biogenic aerosol. Fungal spores, the bacteria from the surface of leaves. So a famous one is the bacteria that makes snow, right? Pseudomonas syringae makes snow. You need an aerosol. And then another aerosol comes from pines. It's those aromatic volatile carbons that we can smell, that smell of pine. So if you're in a northern forest where it's all pine trees, they still have rain. That's because that green stuff is making those biogenic aerosols. So what those do is those are big and steady. And the more you have of them, the more steady, regular rain you get. So what does this mean for farmers? This is another reason not to till, because tillage creates dust. Dust creates the kind of rainstorms that are infrequent and heavy, right? Whereas if you have cover, you're releasing more of these biogenic aerosols. You also have crop litter, and underneath that, you have that musty smell if you pick it up, right? Those are fungal spores that create rain. So farmers know that if you do a big crop of corn, next week you're going to get a rain. Why? Because it all pollinates, right? That pollen calls the rain down. It literally is a biogenic aerosol that makes raindrops. But if you only have one crop and that's it, then that your farm isn't contributing to any more rain. If you have a cover crop, right? If you have litter, you keep litter on the surface of it, you're preventing evaporation, but you're also making a place for those fungal spores to grow that make more raindrops. So when we have farmers that are in contiguous areas that have more life on their farm, then they have more rain. So green makes blue. Green plants make blue rain. Everybody's familiar with the fact that rain affects plants. But guess what? Plants affect rain. That's the other half of the equation. And so there have been these huge efforts on big parcels of land to change the weather, and it works. So in China, on the Loess Plateau, 8.6 million acres were brought from desert back to productive farm use, right? Because of this, because having more plant life creates more biogenic aerosols, and you balance out that local water cycle.
Wow. And Dr. Heilman, you also spoke about the power of observation and how farmers are such good ecologists and environmentalists, the ones that are trying to regenerate landscapes. And if you could speak a little bit more about seeing it as a system and the power of observation.
Yes. Well, when I teach about rain, it's something that farmers always get intuitively, right? Because farmers know that a crop cover creates a more moist environment. And so farmers can start to observe that the more green cover that you have on a farm, they do get more rain. So Alejandro Correo, who's a rancher in the Chihuahua Desert of Mexico, they have multiple more inches of rain because of using regenerative practices. And that's something that they began to do, but continued because of their own observation. They watch the weather change. And that's why it's important for us in conservation, or anybody that cares about the environment, to have communities of practice. Communities of practice are good because we can share ideas and inspiration and equipment and observation, but they're also good because we can create these healthier zones where we can stabilize the weather. We can reduce drought and we can reduce flooding, because flooding happens also from poor soil. When you don't have good infiltration, healthy soil doesn't absorb the rain that it should get. So this is something that, as people make these changes in a community level, and it can be 5 square miles can be enough, right? Then it's incredibly rewarding, because then you also get control of the thing that feels most out of control, which is weather. Now, there's global patterns we cannot affect, but because global patterns are more unstable, it's especially imperative for us all to really work on restoring ecosystems that we can regionally, and to have enough contiguous farms that are healthy that we can get inches more rain.
And Dr. Heilman, on that note, as we know that ecological systems don't see property boundaries. And so how do you encourage communities to work together and build off of each other in farming communities?
Well, in farming communities, it's much better if farmers encourage each other rather than having it be something that feels like it comes from the outside with policy, right? And so one of the things that is important is that lots of rural communities are relatively isolated. So a lot of rural communities are isolated. And then when we can bring farmers together socially, right? That's good, because it's nice to talk to other people. But then we can all start to compare notes. So when farmers understand that weather crosses borders and you can help each other in a positive way, I find that farmers are really excited to do that and to talk to each other and explain this issue about how rain works. It's something that everybody needs to understand, because it changes the farm to farm relationship from something that could be negative, like pesticides or herbicides cross over the wind and you're going to affect my farm, to something positive, how we can work together. So I think that when you introduce it, when people understand rain, farmers say, oh yeah, that makes sense. They understand it because they're out there every day. They understand the difference between dust, right, and a natural system giving biogenic aerosols are like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Now I understand, right? So I think that that's one of the things that is the most exciting about encouraging entire communities of regenerative practice, because everywhere we go, people are dry. Everywhere we go, even if the inches are the same, they're not coming in the same way. They might have total same rainfall, but they're getting these more intense rains. That has everything to do with land use.
We're talking today with Dr. Elizabeth Heilman, Professor of Education at Wichita State University. This is For the Soil, a Conversation. And Dr. Heilman, I was really intrigued recently when I pulled up a YouTube video with you as the focal point. I believe you were involved with a field day. I believe it was in Texas. And you were talking with the field day attendees about soil health and also dung beetles. And I laugh at that, but you were talking very seriously about dung beetles and soil health. And one of our former guests on this podcast is all about dung beetles. She lives in Western Virginia, and she is very good at regenerative agriculture, pasture management, sustainable beef production, and she is just all about dung beetles. But for our listeners who are not familiar with dung beetles, what are they and what do they do?
Well, dung beetles are the strongest and, to me, one of the most exciting insects on the planet. I have a dung beetle pin on my backpack. Why would I do that? Well, what a dung beetle does is it takes manure and they instantly will bury it into the ground, and they can soil organic matter. And also, there's soil itself has bacteria that help manage methane, methanogenetic bacteria. It's not huge, but it's important. So nature itself handles manure. And it isn't just a matter of removing something negative. When you have a healthy dung beetle population in a pasture productivity is 30% higher, right? And so the other thing that's important to know about dung beetles, if for anybody that has livestock, is that livestock traditionally in nature, they will move together because they have an apex predator like a wolf. And then that is this whole idea of rotational grazing, where you purposefully keep cattle together and you move them and then they don't come back for a while. Another part of that isn't just the plant recovery, but the dung beetles need to follow up the animals. Dung beetles can fly 30 miles in a day, but they don't want to do it every day. They like to follow right along when you have sheep, when you have cattle, right? And so when they will come right behind them and they will take all that manure and they will put it into the ground. Healthy dung beetles makes for 30% more pasture productivity. So this is something that I think is at the forefront of some of our best changes in farming, is that we have to look at the little things. So your insect population can be huge. It's like biogenic aerosols. They're invisible, but they can have such an impact on your operation. So dung beetles are reduced by ivermectins, the mectins that worm. So if anybody's ever had that, then they need to restore dung beetles, right? Bring them back. So there's a Facebook group for trading dung beetles, but it isn't something that, yep.
There's a Facebook group for trading dung beetles. Grandpa, we have come a long way.
They will eat any kind of manure. Yeah, and if you look up dung beetles on Amazon for a book, there's a couple of nonfiction books for farmers or conservationists, but there's something like 20 children's books about dung beetles because they're so strong and heroic and apparently fascinating that you can get a lot of children's books about them. So if you don't have dung beetles, go get you some.
And Dr. Heilman, I also think it's probably like a metaphor for people that are providing education or technical services too, is the times that I've observed dung beetles, they're usually, pushing the manure down a path, maneuvering it. And I think when we think about support processes for ecology and environmental change, how can we be collaborative and cooperative, maybe like a dung beetle?
Yep. Nature is very commensal, right? And so that's something that we have to think about, adding as much of those reinforcers into our farms that we can. So dung beetles are there to help us. How do our insects help us have more profit, have more stability, right? And even rain is something that happens commensally with plants. And those little bacteria, they co-evolve with plants so that they can handle being up in the cold. So a lot of this has to do with farming with nature instead of farming against it. And the closer we look, everywhere we turn, we see resources, whether it's soil biology, right? Dung beetles, insects, even the little tiny biogenic aerosols that make rain. Nature is on our side. So the more we use it, then the more stable our farm systems become. It makes us more emotionally stable because we have more control, right? It makes better food and it makes higher profits.
Just a couple of minutes remaining in today's podcast, and we've been talking with Dr. Elizabeth Heilman with Wichita State University, and I'd like to talk about resources, Dr. Heilman. What resources would you recommend concerning soil health?
Well, fortunately, there's resources almost anywhere you go. And what I find is that a lot of producers like to use their phone and they like to look at YouTube presentations, right? And so I would certainly recommend the free Green Cover Soil Health Resource Guide and the videos that go with those. I think that's a great resource. You can download all the past editions, and some of the most famous people in soil health, like Dale Strickler and Nicole Masters, they have articles that are a couple pages long that digest it. That's a great resource for people that like to learn on your own. Look for some of those resources. So look for the green cover videos. They're very focused often. Those can be great resources.
Green cover videos.
Green Cover Seed, right? It's the biggest cover seed company, and they have a lot of videos that are very focused topics. And every year they publish a free book, a free soil health resource guide. And you can get, if you just write to them, they'll mail you one, and you can download all the previous editions. I think that's a great resource.
Dr. Elizabeth Heilman, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
And that concludes this episode of For the Soil, a Conversation. For the Soil, a Conversation is made possible with funding support from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and the Agua Fund. Other partners include the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service, Virginia Cooperative Extension, Virginia State University, Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation, and partners of the Virginia Soil Health Coalition. Views expressed on this podcast are those of each individual guest. To download a copy of this or any other episode, visit the website forthesoil.org. If you have a specific question about soil health, just call your local extension office or your local USDA Service Center, or perhaps a Soil and Water Conservation District office. Music used during today's program was provided courtesy of the Flip Charts. All rights reserved. For the Soil, a Conversation is produced by On the Farm Radio in collaboration with Virginia Tech. I'm your host, Jeff Ishee.